and welcome to the fourth Marine Restoration webinar hosted by Ocean and Coastal Futures, where today we'll be exploring the latest advances in marine restoration finance and how we can align financial opportunities with sustainable marine stewardship to meet our ambitious marine commitments and ensure a thriving and prosperous ocean for current and future generations. This webinar is part of a series that Ocean and Coastal Futures is hosting, generously supported by Esme Fairbairn Foundation and the Environment Agency. Ocean and Coastal Futures is a convener of change in the ocean sector, and through this series we want to create a space to learn about, discuss and debate the progress, needs and opportunities for marine restoration in the UK. We hope the lessons learned in these sessions can help move forward the work in this sector. My name is David Tudor, I'm one of the directors of OCF, and we have a brilliant panel who I'll introduce you to shortly. Elizabeth Beale from Finance Earth, Peter Lee from WWT, Rachel Evatt from Sun Art Fields and Rewilding Britain, and Alex Thompson from the Crown Estate. But before I do that, I just want to give you a bit of background on the role of the finance community in the ocean. And there's a growing awareness among economic and financial policymakers about the climate and nature-related risks. But the focus is on the economic implications of the loss of terrestrial ecosystems mainly. And this overlooks the ocean's vital contributions to regulating the climate, managing the impacts of climate change, and providing other provisioning and regulating services. Although gaps remain, the financial sector is increasingly paying attention to the opportunities presented by the blue economy. The benefits of providing additional financial resources to activities that contribute to a healthy ocean are clear, and more public-private partnerships, multilateral development and funding, and official development assistance are needed to achieve this. Banks, insurance providers and investors also have a crucial role to play in supporting the conservation and sustainable development of the ocean and marine resources. Financial institutions, through their products, services and relationships with their industry clients, can help to preserve and protect the ocean by financing the transition to a sustainable ocean economy. The principal objective of blue finance is to generate beneficial outcomes to the marine environment. By facilitating and labelling investments, it plays a pivotal role in ensuring the regeneration, protection and sustainable use of the ocean and its resources. Blue finance represents a niche yet rapidly evolving area within the broader landscape of sustainable finance and has garnered considerable interest from a diverse array of stakeholders, including investors, financial institutions and issuers across the globe. Blue finance can be broken down into four key categories: debt, such as loans and bonds; equity, that's venture capital and investment funds; subsidies; impact, so corporate social responsibility investment, public grants; and protection, such as insurance. But some statistics for you, the kind of blue finance gap, as we call it. So the ocean is a key component in the sustainable development of many coastal regions. However, the UN Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 14, Life Below Water, receives the least official development assistance of all 17 SDGs, and that's according to the World Economic Forum. To achieve the objectives of the SDG 14, an estimated annual investment of around $175 billion is required until 2030, and to harness the potential of the ocean to mitigate against climate change, additional annual investment of around $1 trillion is required until 2030. Ocean-based climate solutions such as offshore wind or zero-emission vessels have the potential to close the carbon emissions gap, but the difference between where emissions are heading and where they need to be to meet the 1.5 target is up to 35% by 2030. And marine nature-based solutions to climate change support climate adaptation and resilience, such as Seagrass and Salt Marsh Restoration Project, received only around 9% of the total finance for nature-based solutions in 2022, according to UNEP. And philanthropic contributions to ocean conservation, approximately 1% or less than 1% of the global philanthropic funding. So you can see there's a lot of gaps there, a lot to discuss throughout this next webinar. So before you hear from our expert panel on this and many other topics around finance and marine restoration, a little bit of housekeeping. The delegates here today are all muted and your cameras are off. You will see there is a chat function. So use this to introduce yourself to each other if you'd like, and to make comments or to share resources. There's also a Q&A function next to the chat, you'll see at the top of your screen. So please use this to pose any questions you have to the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the session. And this Q&A function can be anonymous if you'd like it to be, or you can put your name in. If you'd like a question, that someone else has posed, you can upvote it. If you have any problems using the Q&A function, please use the chat instead, and we will place that into the Q&A. So now I'd like to ask our panelists to turn on their cameras, please, and to ask you to introduce yourselves and to say just a few words. Welcome. So if I could start with you, Elizabeth, please.
Thank you, David, and nice to see you all today. Glad to be joining this discussion, which is critically important, as David outlined in his introductory remarks around the significant gaps that exist and the need to mobilize more finance for marine and coastal restoration. As in building on some of the statistics that David outlined in his initial remarks, and the critical role that the UK's salt marshes, seagrass play in not only sequestering carbon, even more so than UK woodlands, for example, but also the considerable marine biodiversity and other ecosystem services that are provided by marine and coastal environment are crucial, and not mobilizing currently the scale of finance which is required, which is really where our focus is at Finance Earth. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're an employee-owned social enterprise, really with the mission to mobilize more private capital for climate, nature, and communities, which is why over the last few years we've been focusing particularly in the marine environment, given the scale of investment required, but also the stage and level of financing that is flowing, which is behind what has been achieved in terrestrial markets. A few years ago, we collaborated with a range of partners, including the Crown Estate, Blue Marine Foundation, Esme Fairbairn, Pollination, and a range of other actors to develop, and Blue Marine Foundation, to develop a roadmap for scaling investment in high integrity marine natural capital markets in the UK. I can pop the link to that in the chat for people that haven't engaged with it yet or are unaware of it. But really the roadmap was aiming to outline a set of concrete actions which all stakeholders can see a role in contributing to really scale and mobilize more finance for marine and coastal restoration across the UK, and looking at what the current barriers are, which I know Peter's going to speak to a bit on that, and how to address those barriers, but also then what is specifically needed, so to really try to drill down in terms of those actions that each stakeholder group can take. Since the launch of the roadmap, we've then been working with a range of partners across the UK, from local government authorities, so working with some of those partners in Scotland, but also in England and Wales, to look at what the specific opportunities are and what the interest is. So that can include, as I said before, salt marsh, seagrass. It can also include fisheries, so it isn't often grouped in this category, but is a critical area to focus on. And one point I do want to underline is when you talk about scaling investment, what you need across both terrestrial and marine environments is a revenue stream. So investment flows where there is a revenue stream to repay that investment. And that revenue stream really comes from demand. So where is there a demand for, whether that's natural capital or those ecosystem services that David outlined in his intro? And how can we then look at not only increasing that demand, but also ensuring that that the demand for, whether that's carbon credits or biodiversity uplift or fisheries improvement, how that can be structured in a way where investors can actually engage. So that's one of the key challenges that we've been addressing with partners, is to help to build, what may be really great projects on the ground that are happening, but may not be actually achieving that investment readiness, or ability to actually mobilize capital, which can come down to the way that they're structured, or the way that even the impact is being communicated. So to really address some of those issues, we see as critical to really mobilize more capital in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was a great little introduction there, and I think some of the points you mentioned we'll follow up on around increasing demand and the roadmap you mentioned, as well as fisheries, as you said, and talked about in this field. I'd now like to ask Alex to introduce himself and say a few words. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so my name is Alex Thompson. I'm the Marine Strategy Director at the Crown Estate. So as well as our marine strategy, our team also looks at the marine planning and environmental policy. So we're particularly interested on the, as Elizabeth was saying, the demand side of marine finance and restoration. So particularly focusing on things like the Marine Recovery Fund, which is looking at strategic ways to compensate for the impacts of development in the marine space. Just to take a step back, just to give for those who don't know about the Crown Estate, so we're the custodians, the landlords of the seabed in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And we have a kind of a long overarching purpose to create a lasting value for the nation. And when we talk about value at the Crown Estate, we're not just talking about financial value, although that is important. We return financial value to Treasury, but we also talk about supporting net zero, helping create thriving communities. So that's the kind of community place-based work that we do. But also we're trying to take a lead in stewarding the marine environment as well. So a lot of that work is looking at areas that are important for natural restoration and compensation for, as I say, for projects. And so, yeah, I'm particularly interested in, we do a lot of work with government about the kind of policy drivers for marine restoration. So I've already mentioned the Marine Recovery Fund. Part of that is identifying strategic compensation measures which can be implemented to offset development. So we're interested in that at the Crown Estate for a couple of ways. So one is obviously we lease the seabed for industries such as offshore wind. So that's an important way to enable development. But also we have a coastal and marine estate that could be used for those compensation purposes. So whether it's restoration of coastal habitats or allowing access and kind of even whether it's potential for leasing areas just for the purposes of nature restoration and recovery. So that's an area we're looking at, and we're really exploring, as Elizabeth said, with a number of different partners. And I should just say, Caroline Price, who was unable to make it today, but she's the head of our nature team, and so she has it's a relatively new area for the Crown Estate. The team has been established for a couple of years now, but the stewardship and protection of nature is absolutely one of our kind of key pillars now at the Crown Estate, and we're really trying to work out how we support that through nature restoration, capital markets, and that kind of enabling the developments to happen alongside supporting the right mechanisms to make that happen. So thanks, David.
Great, thanks, Alex. That was really good. Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce Rachel to join us to speak. Rachel.
Hello everyone, and thanks David. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm wearing two hats today. So I have a rewilding project, a land-based rewilding project based in Derbyshire, just outside the Peak District, which I've been managing for 5 years, just about. And under that sort of project, we've been part of a few kind of pilot studies into nature-based financing. And the most significant one is probably the biodiversity net gain credits pilot, which has been run by Natural England. So we've been one of 5 landholders that have been selected to have dialogue and explore the ways in which the credits scheme might work over the past 3+ years. So I'm kind of bringing that perspective. Additionally, I am a trustee and vice chair of the charity Rewilding Britain. For those of you who are not familiar with Rewilding Britain, it does include rewilding of the land and sea. We have a network of projects around the country that are engaged with the process of rewilding, and a good number of those are also looking at the kind of financing aspects. So there's about 1,000 projects in the network just now, which incorporates about 150,000 hectares of land and just over 500 kilometres squared of sea. But that's expanding all the time, and it also includes a lot of projects that we're engaging with that don't fall under the network. The other aspect of Rewilding Britain's work is we have a innovation and challenge fund. So that's where some of our funding is redirected to rewilding projects on the ground. And the Sussex Bay project, which is a marine project, was one of the recipients of a significant amount of funding most recently from Rewilding Britain. So I'm hoping to bring the perspectives from both of those angles. I think there's a number of different kind of challenges that we've observed through engaging with biodiversity net gain as a kind of private landholder that's looking to transact in that market. And so I think we offer an interesting perspective, as that is a very nascent market and is developing all the time. I think a number of the challenges that I would talk to, there's challenges around ensuring that whatever is being mitigated is done within the equivalent proximity, and in doing so, that could be quite restrictive to market flowing. So there's that trade-off between improving the environment in the place where harm is done, but also ensuring that there is some scope for a kind of central funding to mean that equivalent habitats can be created elsewhere so that that funding does continue to flow. Another area I'm interested in is kind of the pricing in of risk and ensuring against risk over the very long-term nature of such schemes. And that can be environmental risk associated with climate change and ensuring that habitats are maintained and developed over that long-term horizon. But it's also quite simply around things like insolvency risk and the risk of parties involved in the guarantees being insured against over this very long-term horizon. Quality standards are another aspect. So thinking about sort of responsible bodies that are there to ensure that the habitats being created or restored meet that kind of quality standard and are verified over the long-term horizon. And I'd also talk about restoring versus protecting. Biodiversity net gain is very much incentivized towards restoring nature. So having a very low baseline is almost a very good thing, because then you can create against that baseline. Whereas there is challenges around taking good habitats and protecting those and pricing equivalently so that they can kind of compete in that market. And then I'd also say, there's challenges around kind of not just net zero, but net gain. So that there's opportunities to do better through development that is taking place. So I'm sure various themes, David, that you'll want to pick up on there.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's great to have your terrestrial eye on this, really, because as you mentioned, certainly from the marketplace, it's a little bit ahead of marine, and you talked about B&G, and there's lots of talk around marine net gain as well. So we'll get into all of that. It's really interesting. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Peter Lee from WWT. Over to you, Peter.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. So yeah, my name's Pete Lee. I'm Head of Philanthropy and Partnerships at WWT. For people that aren't familiar with us, WWT is the charity for wetlands and wildlife. We've got an ambition to restore 100,000 hectares of wetland across the UK by 2050. And within that, we see a particular opportunity on our coastline. So that's a real area of focus for the charity. We manage 10 wetland sites. It covers about 6,000 hectares of land. Within that, our largest is Steert in Somerset, Steert and Bridgewater Bay, where we manage around 3,000 hectares of land, which is a combination of salt marsh and intertidal mudflat. We've also got kind of new projects in the area. So nearby to Steert, we're working with Bristol Ports, where we're looking to create 187 hectares, again, a mixture of intertidal, salt marsh and freshwater habitats. We've also, just the other side of the Severn, recently purchased a site at a place called Orr, which is just under 150 hectares. And again, that's going to be for a major salt marsh restoration project through managed realignment. That site's going to act as a real hub for us to conduct new research to study what we call the superpowers of salt marsh. So their ability to store carbon, to boost biodiversity, but also to improve flood resilience, which I think for coastal marine habitats is another massive benefit that we should probably talk about, where there's a real opportunity in terms of financing. The work we've done so far is being funded largely through a combination of kind of philanthropy, compensatory habitat schemes. We are moving slowly. It feels like sometimes, I think, along with the rest of us, towards this these kind of unlocking some of this private capital. But we are testing more and more models, and we're seeing opportunities come through. So things like BNG and rising demand, looking at models where we can make the numbers kind of add up for things like carbon credits as the Saltmarsh Code continues to develop. So I think there's a lot on the horizon where we're seeing kind of exciting opportunities, testing things and kind of finding ways to overcome the current blockers or barriers that we're confronted with. I think one thing we are seeing, the scale that we want to operate and the complexity of this space, partnership and collaboration is absolutely critical. There is no one party that can do this by themselves. So I think that's why these kind of forums are so important, kind of sharing progress, updates, and trying to kind of help each other and identify those collaborations that are going to help us unblock some of these things to for the benefit of everyone. I've got a few slides next, David. Do you want me to kind of go straight on?
That'll be excellent. Thanks, Peter. Go for it.
Perfect. So I kind of had the opportunity just to provide a bit of an introduction and a bit of context. So I'm just going to share a few slides to give a bit of a background. I should start by saying one of the things I've really enjoyed about this webinar series is it has focused on kind of where we are right now. You go to a lot of webinars where they say things which were equally true 5 years ago, and I think this has been a real strength of this. Having said that, these slides do kind of just go back and cover a bit of old ground. So just kind of bear with me. We'll go through, but I think it's important to give a little bit of context into kind of where we've come from and where some of the opportunities are. So if I go through, hopefully you can see this. I'll click through so you can see the first slide here. Maybe one of the panelists can jump in if the screen isn't appearing properly, but just a couple of slides to go through. And coming from WWT, I can't be on a webinar like this without starting with a message just to say wetlands are amazing. You know, there are huge opportunities to go after. And so before we go straight into the kind of finance opportunities, I think it is important that we just do give that kind of breadth of benefits that these habitats provide. The British Isles are a really important place globally for this kind of narrow fringe of coastal water that we've got. They're some of the most productive places in the globe in terms of kind of their biodiversity, their importance to nature. They also knit everything together. So they're a really important crossroads for migratory species, for birds and for fish. Very important habitats for nurseries, as touched on in the introduction. And crucially, they're also kind of mutually reinforcing systems. And this is something that I think was covered in a previous episode of this series. But you get all these beneficial, kind of mutually beneficial dynamics between the different habitats. So the oysters clearing the water that creates conditions for seagrass, the seagrass reducing the current flow that can protect the salt marsh, and the export of the organic matter from these habitats fueling coastal productivity further out to sea. So there's massive benefits of thinking at that real landscape scale beyond kind of individual habitats and looking at that multitude of benefits that can be provided. And then when you get beyond the biodiversity benefits, you can then, as I've touched upon, huge values in terms of flood alleviation, also their ability to purify our water, and not forgetting also providing space for well-being, for recreation, and for food. I think it's Tony Juniper that talks about this kind of false choice between farming and nature. That's just as true on our coastline as it is in a kind of terrestrial land. Kind of marsh grazing lands and opportunities that can be provided here. This isn't kind of an either or between nature or farming. There's definitely opportunities for both. So when you look at all those benefits, I suppose the next obvious question then is looking at, well, where are the opportunities for restoration? And again, it's been touched upon. There's loads. It's quite unfortunate that there's so many. There's so many opportunities because we've lost so much of this habitat that there's kind of loads to go after. So you can see from the slides here, just some of those losses, 84% of salt marsh lost over the last couple of 100 years. The map on the left-hand side, again, shows kind of salt marsh potential. We've got around 30,000 hectares of salt marsh remaining in the UK. There's potential for around 300,000 when you map out areas where there are potential for restoration opportunities. These are habitat types that used to be absolutely abundant across the UK. So seagrass was once so abundant it was used as mattress filler. Oysters were once the food of the urban poor. You know, when you go back in history, these are really abundant habitats. And so there are opportunities out there to look at where restoration can be achieved. And as I've touched on, there's massive benefits of doing that can be explored. This slide is actually drawn from Finance Earth, and it links back to the roadmap that Elizabeth mentioned in her introduction. But there are a wide range of ecosystem services available through these marine habitat restoration projects. We're almost spoiled for choice in terms of it makes it potentially quite a confusing landscape, but there is real progression and progress towards bringing some of these services to market in terms of an investable product. Biodiversity, I think, is one that we're going to focus on later on in this series. We've certainly looked at BNG for habitat types such as salt marsh, where we see a growth in demand coming through the pipeline, and our modelling suggests there are viable projects that could be financed through BNG. So I think there's exciting scope there. Also, in terms of coastal defences, I think currently less than 1% of the budget for coastal defence is spent on natural flood management, and yet these are incredible tools for flood defence, which provide a massive range of additional benefits on top of coastal defence. So there's potentially really substantial headroom there if we can find that kind of mechanism to open up the market. But across the piece, we are, as I said, somewhat kind of spoiled for choice with the amount of benefits that these provide and how we can take those out and identify that demand, which can then be translated into investment. The final slide, I suppose, brings it back down to earth slightly, and again, we'll touch on this, but there are barriers. This is a complicated space. This again draws from the roadmap and some work done by the Crown Estate and Finance Earth in partnership with others. I think around 100 stakeholders were interviewed to look at collating the barriers that we currently face. And that roadmap is well worth a look, and it splits them into these three areas of the current kind of finance barriers, policy and science. This was around, I think, 18 months ago now, and I would say across a number of these we've made really positive progress, but there is still some way to go. Probably as we move into delivery, another barrier or area to be aware of is probably worth considering is community engagement. We need that buy-in for communities to understand the value of these habitats and to really welcome them. And I think there is, again, an important area of work to do there, although that might go beyond the scope of this in terms of looking at the finance opportunities. So yes, covering a little bit of old ground, David, but hopefully that gives a bit of background in terms of the opportunity that we're presented with.
Fantastic. Thanks, Peter. That was a really good grounding, really, I think, for the rest of this presentation, rest of this panel, really, and allows some food for thought and a bit of discussion. So thank you for those great introductions. Just a reminder for the audience to please place your questions into the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and if you can't use the Q&A, just put in your chat and we'll make sure it gets to the Q&A. I'm sure the panel would love to hear your questions, so please just pop them in the Q&A or chat. I just want to start off with a broad question, really, to a number of you. You talked about, particularly Peter, then you talked about how currently some of your work is funded. You mentioned the Sturt and other work in the Severn and Bristol Channel area. But I guess my first question to you all is, a lot of the work that's been funded to date in the marine environment in particular is essentially through philanthropy. And I suppose my question is, from a very high level point of view, are the kind of new instruments, are the innovation that's coming through, is the private finance, almost going to arrive in time? Are we going to sort out these mechanisms in time for the nature emergency? Now, I'm not going to give you a number and say, you know, is it going to be there by 2029 or 2032? But you get my point. You know, is this all in theory great, but is it actually going to arrive in time to help the nature crisis? So I might start with you, Elizabeth, and then come to you, Peter. Elizabeth.
Well, some crystal ball gazing there, I guess. I think the answer to that is really around you need a combination of both carrots and sticks. So we can arrive more quickly where we have you know, regulation that drives that demand. So obviously BNG has been a great example of that in terrestrial and coastal environment to regulate, where, you know, then there is a requirement for property developers to achieve, you know, at least a 10% gain, where we can have regulation that's focused on the marine and coastal environments in particular can help drive that demand across multiple sectors. So that could, you know, extend beyond property development, for example. So that's one key piece that could help us get there faster. Another is around, you know, the carrots. So, you know, where there's initiatives like TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is providing a framework for corporates that want to show, you know, that they're progressive on assessing where there is nature-related risk and what they can do about it. So we've seen a lot of traction, for example, from companies that are looking at assessing risk in their supply chain and then looking at how they can address and mitigate that risk. And often that comes hand in hand with nature restoration, which is great. It's not an either or. Actually, when you look at, you know, for example, I said fisheries earlier, by improving fishery, by addressing things like reducing bycatch and stock assessments and all of that, that then is actually making the fishery more resilient. And, you know, corporates have an interest in that as well. So that can help drive demand and then further private capital for the restoration of fisheries. But similarly in coastal defense, you know, tourism sector has a lot to gain by improving coastal defense. And so where you can be making those connections more and providing incentives for corporates to be demanding and then mobilizing more private capital in those areas, I think the combination of both those carrots and sticks will be really critical to moving as quickly as we can. But I can't give you a year.
So. No. It's a tough question. It was a bit theoretical one, but that's really good. Thank you, Elizabeth, around those carrots and sticks. And you mentioned risk there, and I know that Rachel mentioned the pricing in of risk around, you know, climate change. We'll come on to that, I think. But I'll ask the same question to you, Peter, around that. You know, is it going to happen fast enough, the innovation and the private finance coming into the market?
Brilliant. And yeah, first of all, I'm really glad you didn't ask me first, because that's a tough question. I think that's a really good it's a really good summary by Elizabeth about how we can get there faster and how we can do more. I feel like I could give a really positive and a pretty negative answer, and they both be true. At times there's frustrations that we're not able to move quicker, and there's certainly barriers. But there is really strong progress being made, and we're seeing demand certainly take up, and absolutely as the regulation and kind of policy starts to come in, and that kind of stick approach kind of enforces a certain level, that's making a big difference. I would say at a kind of project level, we're going to see some massive opportunities and some big successes that we can really celebrate and get behind in terms of, you know, really high integrity projects that are being funded through investment that are showing a pathway forward. I've less confidence that this is going to kind of close that huge finance gap that we're currently faced by. But I do think there's going to be, a continuing very positive and accelerating trend. So I think there is really good stuff. But I would, you see that the graph sometimes, don't you, of kind of where we are now in terms of finance and where we need to get to and what that gap is. It's a huge number, and we don't have much time. So there's, I think that would be maybe overly optimistic to say this is the answer. But I think certainly at that kind of local and regional level, this is going to be a very, very important solution, which is going to deliver some really exciting nature restoration projects.
Thanks, Peter. And just to be clear for the audience, then, if that gap isn't going to be filled, or you're less confident about it, well, how is it going to be funded then? Is it continuation of philanthropy and grants and all of that, basically?
I think philanthropy at the moment has got a really important role to play. It can provide that kind of development and catalyst funding. And I think the more of these projects that we can develop, and that our site at OR is being a really good example, where we can create these demonstration sites that can plot a path forward and show people how to navigate some of the current complexities. I think that can accelerate the change. So I think it's about the more we can do at the moment to accelerate, like Elizabeth said, to share best practice, to show people pathways through. I think we are currently stifled in some ways through that, where a lot of these projects are currently done with a certain level of secrecy. I think sometimes big opportunities will come up, maybe seeking investment or projects. The first thing that happens is an NDA will be signed, and you often will not see the pathway towards kind of delivery. You will just see the press release at the other side saying this is happening. So I think there's more we can do to kind of share progress and best practice to kind of help each other and move quicker. But I think that's our challenge collectively is how do we move faster and how do we share that best practice to make sure that we can meet the urgency that we're faced with.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting, that point, isn't it? When you come to commercial arrangements, commercial negotiations, obviously confidentiality is kind of paramount, but that doesn't really help the wider process, as you said. So that's an interesting point. A few people have mentioned BNG, biodiversity net gain, and I'd like to ask Rachel about this, because obviously the system on land terrestrially has been functioning for a little while, still in infancy, still pilots, and you're part of a pilot, as you said. And then I'll come back to you in a minute again, Peter, because I know that obviously, well, perhaps the question will be really, is that intertidal, or is that salt marsh, like intertidal area, different to what we see in fully terrestrial, let's put it that way. But first, Rachel, coming to you really, just on the BNG and starting with, I guess, a very high level question. For you, I guess, is it working? Is the system working? Is the market working? Is if it's not, what needs to be done, or is it just because it's nascent? But what do you think of that, Rachel, the whole BNG process at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, David. So I suppose I would share a similar sentiment to Peter, that I think there's a lot of positives, but there's also a frustration in terms of the speed and I suppose the detail around the scheme. So just to give a bit of background, so biodiversity net gain kind of came in legislatively in November 23, and in June 2024, it came kind of fully into practice with the introduction of biodiversity net gain credits. So the sort of the way in which the market operates is that if you're doing development, then you need to offset ideally within your local planning authority or national character area. And if you can't do that, you have the opportunity to buy at an inflated price from a sort of area that's adjacent to. Or if you really can't do that, then you can buy at a super inflated price from the government's credits sort of pot. And so I would say, what is positive is that we now have the mechanisms in place for that exchange of monies. So credits can be bought and sold. There is a national biodiversity units register, and exchanges are taking place, and biodiversity units are being created and habitats being restored at the back of that. And in theory, the idea around that kind of geographical limitation makes sense, so that nature can be improved in the area where it's also being harmed, if you like. So it's important that it doesn't just get removed from that local geographic area entirely. The challenge, however, is that the monies are not necessarily flowing through the government's credit system in a way that means that we're going to meet targets as quickly as we would like. And there's a number of reasons for that. So one is that the sort of legal infrastructure around securing credits requires either a private sector, what's called a conservation covenant. So a responsible body has to put that in place, that sort of legal legislative document, and that's very nascent. So there's only, I think, 3, possibly 4 responsible bodies in the country. All of the sort of the mechanisms that they operate are kept quite behind closed doors, so it's difficult for others to copy and learn from that. And the vast majority of units are sold through the local planning authority having to have the legals in place through what's called a Section 106 agreement. And it's very variable across the country, which councils are sort of on this and proactive and kind of ready to sort of do business, if you like. And there's many other councils that just are a bit rabbit in the headlights, sort of they've got a backlog perhaps of development waiting to take place, but haven't got the kind of legals in place. So that's one of the disadvantages in pushing that legal framework to a very local level. So I'd say, you know, it's great, you know, Britain's quite far on with sort of having the essence of this scheme in place, but it's not yet flowing. And you know, the other point I didn't mention, but which we could go into as well, is the sort of insurance and risk mitigation that mean that landholders, or you know, those that are provisioning of the habitat, have the certainty that they can kind of price in the risk effectively, and sort of do that for the long term at a level which buyers are willing to pay. And that kind of pricing hasn't yet been shook out really. There's very big extremes between what the pricing of units will be in one area and another.
Thanks, Rachel. It's really interesting in all of that, really. And you mentioned the kind of conservation covenant and the bodies, and you mentioned local authorities in that. One would assume that when it comes to, if we get to a place where there's a marine net gain, obviously perhaps the Crown Estate would be such a body, you know, and there's obviously no local authorities offshore, but there are obviously local authorities at the coast. So, I mean, Alex, I don't know if you're involved or know about marine net gain, but I just wondered, and have you got any knowledge of the Crown Estate involved in that discussion, really, about, you know, learning lessons from BNG and how M&G might work if it does emerge?
Yes. So we are working with DEFRA and the relevant teams in DEFRA about marine net gain, and we're also considering how we can you know, identify areas for nature restoration and recovery as part of our seabed kind of delivery plan. And so at the moment we are developing something we call our marine delivery route map. So that's where we're taking a really holistic approach to the future of the use of the seabed. So in the past, we used to do things in a kind of case-by-case basis. We would have a leasing round for offshore wind, or we'd identify aggregates areas, or people come to us with cable, you know, asking for cable routes. We're trying to do that far more holistically now, and at the heart of that is planning for nature and planning for the future areas that are very important to nature. And so with this route map, we're identifying, we've kind of got a lot of mapping behind this and a lot of GIS, but we're trying to identify areas that are very important for nature recovery and restoration that may not be already within designated sites. And so we work with sort of DEFRA, and the Marine Net Gain team are very aware of this. And so we're considering how that could work in the future. So you know, and this is all kind of things we're working through. But could you lease the seabed for nature restoration or nature protection? That's not like a panacea, because we don't have powers over some industries. Like we can't implement fishing, you know, regulations, or there's other things we can't do. But by leasing for nature, what we're effectively saying is we're not leasing it for any of the other industries which the Crown Estate are responsible for. And so that alone is kind of a way of signalling that there's not going to be kind of other pressures potentially in those areas. So we are that's an area we're looking at and working through how that could work as the kind of seabed landlord. In terms of working specifically on marine net gain, this is obviously marine net gain is quite a bit behind BNG, and so we're trying, you know, and it is a bigger challenge in the marine environment. And we're trying to work out how that would work alongside other strategic measures. I think one thing which is really important to note is that this particular government are really working towards a strategic approach to nature restoration, which is a move away from some of the project by project. For example, if you're talking about offsetting development impacts, which MNG would do, there's definitely a move to a strategic approach. So I think we're quite keen to work with government to use that strategic approach to marine net gain, so that and alongside our route map to identify a more strategic approach to where net gain could happen, and you're not trying to tie it to individual development projects, which is probably more which is happening terrestrially. So that's just the other point to note. I think with the things like the Planning and Infrastructure Bill and MNG coming through and the Marine Recovery Fund, we're trying to work out how all these different policy drivers kind of link together, and then how we can play a part in that kind of strategic identification of areas, or the restoration areas.
Thanks, Alex. It's really interesting, and this perhaps, or maybe too early for you to answer this, but I'm sure the audience would like me to ask this question. Really, when you're talking about potentially leasing areas of seabed for nature, I mean, how do you make that choice when there's, if there's areas there for aggregates, areas there for offshore wind, areas for nature? One would imagine sometimes those three things overlap. So how do you make that choice of whether to lease for nature when there's other commercial interests you could lease for?
Yeah, so this is exactly what we're grappling with our route map, our marine delivery route map. So the first thing to say is it's very heavily data driven. So we've got very good, we've kind of mapped the seabed down to 1 kilometre square areas for all of those different sectors. So you can really get an idea of which areas are being used. And then we also forwardcast right out to 2050 and try and predict kind of demands for different sectors that might likely happen. We all know the seabed potentially is going to get busier as you look out into the future. And so once we have a very good idea of seabed use now, and then we try to consider kind of demands for different marine sectors, that's when we start to run a number of different scenarios for the future. So we can actually say, let's run a scenario that would give you potentially cheaper electricity, and where would that spatially resolve things out, or what's the maximum nature protection scenario for the future, and then what would that do for seabed use in the future? So we've actually run hundreds of these different scenarios, and we start to narrowing it down with to a number of like core pathways that potentially could happen in the future. And all of this is backed up by really extensive engagement. So we're trying to engage through a number of different stakeholders, make sure we've got the right data and evidence in there. We're ground truthing these scenarios. And the other thing to say is we're considering how much co-location can happen for those different marine sectors and nature. So, can you co-locate nature protection with a wind farm, or can you fishing co-locate with other industries? And so we're trying to consider how that works as well. And kind of by putting all that in the mix, we should be able to hopefully find a pathway through that achieves nature protection up front, and then it also still hits the net zero targets, the other targets for the different sectors that are out there. So it's not an easy thing to do, but there's a lot of kind of work behind it, and critically, it's trying to work with other partners and stakeholders to try and get as much information in there as we can.
Thanks, Alex. It's really useful. And I come to the Q&A in a second, so please keep putting the questions into the Q&A or into the chat. And I'll come to you in a second, Elizabeth. A question here around essentially carbon sequestration habitats versus more difficult to quantify services. But before I do that, Peter, I'm just want to follow on for something that Rachel was talking about. And again, I'm making the assumption that the habitats which often WWT works in at the coast certainly has come across BNG in some ways, or at least could do. I just wonder your views on it from a coastal point of view, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose the approach we've taken when we've looked at BNG, and when we've focused on salt marsh for this in terms of the coastal opportunity, is I suppose more kind of theoretical at this stage. We haven't got any live projects, as has been discussed. It's still kind of very early stages of the market, but we've done a piece of work to look at the viability of managed realignment, so salt marsh restoration projects, through various kind of funding mechanisms. And BNG is one which does kind of score very, very strongly. We did a piece of work with several partners where we took a dozen potential sites across the UK for managed realignment. We looked at their feasibility in terms of the budget and the cost side, and then stacked that against the potential ROI. I think it's kind of been proven beyond doubt now that the economic value is there for these sites, but in terms of actually a commercial return to an investor, can we get that kind of 10% ROI that an investor might look at? Can we get the cash flow to work so that the modeling across a kind of 20-30 year time frame would be successful? We found the majority of sites we struggled to make the numbers kind of stack up, and where we looked purely at carbon credits in particular, we didn't see a route where kind of carbon alone as an investment worked. But when we looked at BNG alongside carbon. So kind of imagine splitting a site so that it's kind of a percentage of it is generating BNG and another percentage generating carbon. That's where we did see potential for kind of a model that would generate that return for salt marsh. And we looked at sites of kind of 200 to 500 hectares in size. So on paper, there's an opportunity there. I'd agree with Rachel's point that kind of I think we have to be kind of careful with BNG. There are issues about kind of potentially moving everything entirely off-site. Kind of like a pay to pollute kind of mentality is something we kind of want to avoid. But there are opportunities when we look at kind of aggregating and pooling that funding into strategically valuable projects. So potentially that kind of BNG income might be that part of the mix that can help make some of these projects kind of financially kind of stack up and be viable. So we've certainly got models. We had some great support from Triodos Bank that helped us run financial models that looked at what might be kind of profitable to an investor, and we think there is scope there to use BNG on the coast.
Thanks, Peter. So I suppose that signals really that there's multiple sources of funding except BNG plus potentially carbon credits, and I guess, but also I guess what you're saying at the moment is probably the impact investment, the ones that aren't asking for the real kind of big returns, is where it's at. But yeah, that's interesting. I think around BNG. Go on, Peter. Yeah.
And sorry, just to go back to a point Alex made about responding to your question about how to prioritize sites. I thought just one tool and I'll put it in the chat. Again, looking at the coastal wetlands rather than out onto the seabed. WWT recently produced a map which looks at trying to help answer that question of where to prioritize. So you can look at the coastline on this Data Explorer link, and it's basically a GIS data tool, and it will show all the areas across the UK where there is potential for wetland restoration, so right across the coastline. And then you can overlay various data layers there, which will look at things like level of flood risk, water quality, physical and mental health, and you can start to layer up to see where those wetlands might produce the greatest return or the greatest benefit. So there's a tool there that we're working on. Because I agree with Alex, it's not an easy question to sort of where and where not to kind of prioritize areas, but that might be a tool for people dialing in. That it's free to access, kind of open source information, so it might be a useful tool to people to have a look at.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. You popped in the chat. It's really helpful to everyone if you can have a look at that. I'm going to come to the Q&A now, and as I said, please keep popping the questions in the Q&A. A question for you, Elizabeth, here, which has got the most kind of thumbs up and upvoted here. It says, is there a concern as nature financing increases that it might be biased towards habitats underpinning carbon sequestration, storage, rather than other more difficult to quantify or understand services which are still highly important? What are your thoughts on that, Elizabeth?
I mean, I think it can be a concern in the short term, I would say, in that right now, certainly our engagement with corporates is that they have the budget approval to address carbon initially, and then lower budget to explore other areas. I think that's as I said, I think that's probably a short-term problem, because I think we're seeing the trend move towards where a higher number of corporates are really engaging with the wider set of nature outcomes and thinking about those nature outcomes, but also, as I said before, the risk in their supply chains and what kind of then actual actions or restoration of nature can address those risks. So I think it's probably a short-term issue, hopefully, in terms of where corporates feel more comfortable to date and have done, the work internally to get internal buy-in to release budget for carbon. But hopefully that's just a matter of time until that increases in terms of a wider set of initiatives and habitats. Just around whether that prioritizes types of habitats that have higher carbon sequestration. I think this is an important point that Peter started to touch on, is where you're looking at the habitat itself that needs to be restored, looking at the range of outcomes that can be achieved, and where carbon might be one of them. Obviously, you then need to be able to make the case and be able to quantify the others. And so that's where there's more difficulty sometimes, as the question outlines, to quantify other nature outcomes. And so that's where we need to be putting some of the public funding, research funding, to make sure that we can get that to the point where we can have more quantified outcomes across a range of areas.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really good point, David, isn't it? Really, I think is that, you know, as you mentioned, the investors kind of upskilling themselves, knowledge beyond carbon, but also perhaps there isn't just the information out there, and more funding needs to go into understanding those other ecosystem services and benefits. Rachel, I don't know if it's relevant to you, this question as well, around have you seen on your land or the discussions in the pilots around you know, habitats that are carbon, well, more prone to carbon sequestration than others, and those more difficult to quantify services. Does that come up in the B&G discussions?
Certainly, yes, yeah, absolutely. So when you're taking a kind of a baseline plot of land and deciding to put it into B&G, aside from taking the baseline itself, then deciding what is the most appropriate habitat to be creating on that patch of land is a really important choice. And some of that is a combination of, you know, what the land would naturally be wanting to do, but it's also a case of, you know, what is the kind of the risk associated with perhaps aiming to create a higher quality, richer in biodiversity habitat, but at a higher risk of that maybe not being possible, or there just being unintended consequences over that long-term horizon. And so I'd say the risk appetite of the custodian is a big part of that choice. Ideally, it would just be ecologically what is the right thing, but in practice, it is, well, actually, what are we promising to do? And each kind of habitat that, or each unit type comes with a habitat type that you would create, comes with different condition criteria. So you can aim for kind of low condition, medium condition, or like high distinctiveness kind of criteria. And again, sort of what your risk appetite comes into play there. What your kind of you think can be done, and at what cost over that time period. So like high quality grassland, for example, is much more difficult to create than planting scrub or woodland. And of course, the prices of the units kind of reflect that. So it's a bit of a trade-off between, you know, the economics very much come into play, not just ecologically what's the right thing. And of course, that becomes much more complicated, you know, when it comes to kind of a marine environment, because of course, you know, different habitats can overlap perhaps more distinctly. I know there was also a question, I think it popped up in the chat, which is relevant to this, about, you know, stacking. And so there are possibilities to stack you know, carbon with B&G in a certain land area. So that is also a choice that can be made. But the sort of custodian, the seller of the units, can't be paid twice for the same benefit. So it is quite complex, kind of disentangling what those benefits are and what monies are going to pay for which benefit. And I'd say the market's still very early on in terms of actually teasing that out and practical examples of where that works well.
Thanks. And I think this complexity is kind of really interesting to me. And there's a question in the Q&A which mentions it talks about the distinction between protection and restoration, as you mentioned, Rachel, earlier, really on about, you know, if you leave something alone in the sea, let's say, or you protect it, then very often it'll regenerate and come back to life, sort of thing. It's not always the case. You know, one does have to sometimes lay reefs for oysters, for example, but sometimes the case. But I guess my point really is around that complexity and language and concepts. And I suppose, again, a question for you, Elizabeth, really coming from the finance world, I guess, and the nature world together. How, you know, are there some existing guidelines or existing guides where the finance and practitioners can really communicate and relate together? Is there an issue? I mean, it seems to me it's a real issue that the language and the understanding between those two kind of areas of the world, almost the practitioners and the nature community and the finance community, aren't talking the same language, or if they are, they're not understanding each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. And I think there's been a lot of work done around principles. So, you know, principles, the work that BSI has been doing, for example, around standardization and there's the nature market principles that we worked on with partners in the NGO community around what is, you know, what is a high integrity project in the marine and terrestrial space. I think where there's been less work done is around what are the criteria that buyers or investors need to see in projects, and at a kind of broader scale. So as Peter mentioned, often this is, kept confidential, or each organization has their own specific criteria. This is one of the actions we identified in the roadmap, actually, was to create a kind of buyers alliance to develop a mutually agreed set of criteria that a range of buyers are looking for in the marine and coastal space, so that information could be publicly available to project developers to say, if you want us to be contributing to these types of projects, whether that's through compensation payments or whether that's through proactive addressing of risk or purchasing of credits, they need to meet X, Y, and Z. We need to have this type of data. We need to have this scale. So to have that as a resource for project developers, so that it's not as much of a shot in the dark or needing to engage on a one-by-one basis all the time.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think that idea of common language or platforms, etc., is really important. There's actually a question in the Q&A around the platform. Really, does a platform exist, for funders to link with restoration projects, really? And I think there are a couple out there. And I know that the Environment Agency, through the Rememory and Crown Estate, are working on a platform, that at least an information platform, that might be launched later on this year. I'm just going to move on a little bit around the Q&A, and a question here which has got a lot of votes as well, probably coming to you, Alex. It says most of the projects related to marine restoration seem to focus very much on the coast or coastal habitats. What do you see the opportunities for offshore restoration, and are there specific barriers to these? And perhaps that can kind of lead into something you mentioned earlier around strategic compensation, perhaps, for what the Crown Estate is involved with.
Yeah, and it's a really good question, because it's and I noticed there was a comment in the chat as well, talking about how terrestrially often you need to do something active to change a habitat. So if you have a certain land use, you do something to it and to improve things. Whereas particularly in the offshore environment, often it's just the stopping of doing something allows recovery. And so that's kind of it's very difficult to, for example, to restore a sandbank ecosystem, offshore. You've pretty much got to kind of remove pressures and allow it to recover as best you can, generally. So the first thing to say is, I think that is probably the world that we're in, is to reduce pressures and allow recovery to certain areas. Now, whether that takes place through designation, so there's like highly protected marine areas, or whether it's as I say before, a sort of a conscious choice to stop development in an area which is considered important, that's something we're looking at. I think these will become more important for compensation for projects. I think so just touching on the, as I said before, there's some of the strategic approaches that are being taken. For those who don't know, the Marine Recovery Fund is going to be established by the end of this year. DEFRA are working on it, and the way that works is there's a group called CAUSC, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's a group of SNCBs and others who are looking at strategic compensation measures that they can add to a library of measures, which can then be used by the fund to offset development at a strategic level. And so at the moment, there's not many measures in there, but they are things like building artificial nesting platforms for seabirds offshore. So that is an offshore measure, but that's building something to help a species which is potentially impacted by something like wind farms. There's coastal predator eradication, and then there's DEFRA are looking to designate additional benthic sites for protection. So that additional designation is effectively a kind of a restoration or a recovery scheme. It's removing a pressure to offset pressures from other from development, particularly in this case offshore wind. And so it will be interesting from our point of view. It'll be interesting going forward. How many more measures can be added to that library? I think that's really important. And can some of those measures feed directly into sort of investable projects. So could for example salt marsh be used to offset an offshore project, or are there other schemes that could be kind of set up on a very large scale, bring investors in, and then that's sort of fed into the Marine Recovery Fund that then developers then have to pay into. So there's a kind of there's potentially a market that could be built there. I think so. I think that's a really interesting space that could help some of that offshore development. So that's one thing we're looking at really closely. How do more measures get in? Are there any legislative barriers to allowing for some of those measures to get in? Things like for like compensation, which is kind of the current status quo, as in if you impact birds offshore, then you have to compensate birds offshore or near enough as you can get it. But are there, if you impact the benthic environment offshore, can you offset it somewhere else with a different habitat, as long as you're kind of contributing to the network? So I think it's not as simple as probably terrestrial or coastal, the offshore environment, but it is about kind of reducing pressures, and it is really interesting where this space was going in terms of generating markets for some of those compensation and restoration measures.
Thanks, Alex. And I think you may have said this, so forgive me, but I think I'm right in saying that the Marine Recovery Fund, if and when it is set up, is purely based or targeted for offshore wind developers. Is that right? And that fund will be built up from money from offshore wind developers. Is that correct?
Yes, at the moment. So when it's established, and it's established through a secondary legislation, and the target is by the end of this year. So it's not that far away, probably. And there is interim guidance already been released by DEFRA on how it will be work. That's the case. Longer term, I think it's something we're looking at, and it would really make sense to widen it. I think or it might not be called the Marine Recovery Fund, but widen a similar strategic approach, and then you could potentially wrap things like marine net gain into that same mechanism and deliver marine net gain at a strategic level. So that's kind of a few years down the line. And to your question about how quickly some of this will happen, I think that the quick kind of wins are the big ticket items like offshore wind might drive some of these markets, but I think longer term, I think it would make sense to wrap some of these together and have a single kind of mechanism.
Right, thanks, Alex. Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, just to come in on that point, I do think it makes sense, as Alex has noted, to have it apply to a wider range of sectors. Obviously, there's a range of sectors that are operating in offshore environments in particular, and there's no reason why it couldn't be a pooled fund across multiple sectors, and where there's shared interest in marine recovery in particular. Someone had asked for more information about fishing sector. This is the approach we've taken with the Fisheries Improvement Fund that we manage, which is basically you take pooling funding from a range of supply chain actors who engage in fisheries to then improve the fishery and share the cost of that fishery improvement. So I think it is really applicable across a wide range of sectors.
Right, thanks both for that. Changing tack slightly here, and I'm not sure if anybody can answer this, but I'm going to start with Peter. It says here, considering we have a shortage of public funding, what about small and medium enterprises funding restoration opportunities? How might we get them more involved in restoration? A mechanism that could also provide financial returns or credits. So I guess it's, we talked about some of the I know that it's well known in the media, isn't it, that Aviva, for example, have been involved with WWT. They're certainly not a small and medium enterprise, but how is it possible? Is there a route for small and medium enterprises to get involved in funding restoration?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's a really important area, because at the moment, what we're seeing is some really progressive, kind of exciting thinking coming from the corporate sector, but from companies that can accommodate, teams of 30, 40 in their ESG team, where they can get into all these different programs and all the multitude of acronyms that come with kind of working in the ESG sector. And I think those companies are doing a fantastic job of moving things forward. I think there's a real interest and focus on kind of high integrity outcomes. I think it's exciting, and the work with Aviva that we've done really kind of exemplifies that. But there is then that kind of lag of, well, with kind of the limited resources that we've got, how do we go out and engage and bring in SMEs, kind of small medium companies that they don't necessarily have the resource to put a huge amount of focus into this area, and we as a sector potentially don't have the resource to go out and engage and help them progress. There are things that we've started to do that we've found success in, but it's almost kind of going back a step. It's not expecting those very high standards. It's enabling them to buy into schemes or bigger projects that we're working on. So we've done things like aggregate a range of projects that we are working on, not currently projects which are delivering carbon credits or BNG, but which are aligned to delivering those outcomes. So they are sequestering carbon, they are enhancing biodiversity, and providing opportunities for companies to support and invest in those programs, and then for us to report back at a high kind of a robust level of what those impacts are. So it's a start. It's not something where I think necessarily we have really cracked, but I think it's a really important area that we address, that we don't just rely on this kind of handful of major companies, that we actually help everyone else move forward as well.
Thanks. Elizabeth, yes, please.
Yeah, I think this is linked also to the point, Peter, you were making in the intro around community organization and community capacity building to engage not only in the purchase of credits or units, but also in the implementation of these projects, and to look at, you know, a wider place-based strategy, as Alex was mentioning as well, which can then make the engagement with smaller and medium enterprises easier, because it's around a place. You're bringing together a range of stakeholders, big and small, who all have an interest in that place, both in terms of the supply of nature outcomes, whether that's farmers who are looking at then managed realignment, or it's, you know, medium-sized institutions, whether a local university or otherwise. We've worked with care homes, for example, who are saying, do you know where we could find, you know, 10 carbon credits, but for a relatively low price? So I think when you can make it around a place-based approach and really be then bringing the stakeholders together around what makes sense in terms of both the supply and demand, that's a way to engage with smaller and medium enterprises on both sides.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Rachel.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on, Elizabeth mentioned earlier about TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is optional at present, but it's an accounting mechanism for organisations, companies to be able to kind of account for their impact on nature, and potentially then to you know, you can imagine it building on from there to result in mitigation measures, perhaps through legislation beyond the optional side of things, to channel funds into projects. So that's one area. And the other area is so sort of thinking about improvements on a landscape scale level, where, you know, land and sea interact to provide benefits, and looking at those kind of landscape scale projects, if you like infrastructure projects. So you're kind of thinking about quantifying the whole range of benefits within that landscape area, which might include social benefits, but also, you know, flood mitigation, clean air, as well as carbon sequestration, biodiversity improvement, and so on. And sort of looking at the way in which the benefits can be really distilled, and then made clear to those organisations that are operating within that landscape, to think about how they can potentially buy into the improvements that they benefit from. So it's something Rewilding Britain are looking at. It's early stage, but having sort of the you know, that distilled down into a financial language that is well understood by the market is really interesting and important.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I think that large landscape and seascape interface is really critical, isn't it? And I think it's really interesting what you said about the kind of trying to capture all those benefits and getting that language right. And I should say at this point that OCF is planning an event in the autumn, in September, actually, around blue finance, and a lot of these issues will be tackled then. So that'll be quite a good place to discuss some of this around language and risk and certainty, etc. And I want to come on to that point, actually. You mentioned, Rachel, and I think Elizabeth mentioned it, around certainty and pricing in risk, essentially. Now, the certainty of, and I'm assuming we're talking about the certainty of the restoration working almost, or the longevity of it, and certainly in the marine environment, that that certainty is probably less, you know, in the sense of it's when it comes to offshores, Alex talked about, or when you're talking about habitats that such as seagrass that have been denuded so much, trying to get it back is the certainty of it working is really difficult. But I just wondered if perhaps Rachel and then Elizabeth could talk about really how you kind of overcome that certainty or make investors comfortable enough with the uncertainty, and how do you kind of price in risk, or how is risk involved in all of those? I'll start with you, Rachel.
Sure, yeah. So talking from biodiversity net gain point of view, I think currently the way risk is priced in is via ultimately the end pricing of the units or credits. So the onus is on the provider that's delivering those units to build the price and to sort of build in over that course of 30 years some kind of fat, if you like, for unknowns that might occur. Now, of course, that is, you know, it's quite wide open to interpretation, and those that are providers might have different willingness to kind of take on or even measure and anticipate different levels of risk. What I think is required is the insurance industry to kind of step into this area to provide product which matches up to long-term schemes, which insurers are well used to doing for other development opportunities, but less so for nature-related long-term opportunities. And I believe some insurers are starting to look at this and starting to run the models, but the product doesn't yet exist. So it'll be interesting to watch the space and see how that develops, because that, I think, is a vital piece in the puzzle that will allow more operators to exist within the market, and of course to provide the certainty, as you say, to the buyers to mean that risk is taken care of.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, just to unpack the question a bit, I guess, as risk can be, you know, a range of different risks and can be perceived in different ways in terms. So how you price that, I think, is very dependent on the type of risk that you're assessing. So we address that in a number of ways through the kind of modeling and scenario development, whether that could be when you're looking at BNG, whether that's through the stage sale of units. So, you know, then reducing the risk, then you're only selling units upon when you've reached the condition, you know, the target condition. So different ways to address risk depending on the type of risk. So whether that's delivery risk or whether that's around other, you know, other types of risks in terms of financing and investor perspective. We've seen, for example, to address investor perceived risk in nature markets. And one way to address that is through longer term offtake agreements. So where you can secure upfront offtake agreements, whether that's for carbon or BNG or voluntary biodiversity, that is one way to get investors more comfortable with engaging in these kind of more nascent types of projects.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I suppose same to you, Peter, really. Obviously, with WWT working with investors and, you know, creating salt marsh, for example, in your, and you mentioned Sturt as well. How do you give assurance, or how do you work with the risk of non-performance, I guess, about habitat creation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of areas really. I suppose, firstly, we have a conservation evidence team, and the research we're doing through sites like the one we've purchased at Orr is going to help us kind of fill current gaps. So the current range for things like carbon sequestration at the moment for salt marsh varies substantially depending on where the location is, which estuary, also dependent on the type of design that you look at. So anything that we can do to bring down that range to increase investor confidence is something that we're really focused on, because there is a lot of range in a large number of parameters. So the models that we run on kind of financial viability, there are still gaps there, but I think all we can do at this stage is show that variation and just show a really transparent approach, and essentially price accordingly at the moment. I think the other side of risk that isn't captured maybe as much as it should be, particularly on coastal wetlands, is the risk of doing nothing. You know, a lot of these locations are hugely threatened by floods. We know the benefits of restoration projects at alleviating that risk. You know, we're seeing changes to EA shoreline management plans, which show there's less and less kind of active defence going on around the country. Floods that used to be 1 in 30 years are now kind of 1 in 3 years. You know, there's massive shifts, and the option to just do nothing really isn't there. And I think a lot of the time we don't perceive that. We need to kind of overcome that and be really honest and upfront with people to show that there is a really substantial risk of not acting, and actually then moving on to show the benefits that can be achieved through coastal wetland restoration. And I think it's an area where we probably need to maybe shout a bit louder or be a bit more vocal about this sort of risk of inaction. Because it's a difficult one to quantify, but maybe it's not looked at as much as it should be.
Right, thanks, Peter. We're drawing to a close for our session here today, and I'd just like to give each panelist just a final word, really, on their, I suppose, either their hopes or where they believe things are gonna go next in this whole finance into the oceans and marine environment and nature, really. And I suppose I'll come to you, Rachel. Really, probably the most practical hands-on experience of working in a system in an environment that's regulated, really, in this BNG market, etc. So yeah, to each of you, really, what's your kind of either your hopes or your kind of next big thing you see on the horizon? I'll come to you, Rachel.
Yeah, so I tend to be hopeful by nature. So I am positive by the fact that we've got BNG underway and a market is rolling, and you know, that is bringing private sector investment to nature projects in a meaningful, quantified way. As I said before, there's a frustration that it's not rolling more quickly, and it's got much further to go in terms of landscape scale change rather than just kind of piecemeal units. But I think by the number of different organisations that are engaged in the problem, and I think recognising the urgency of the problem, the need to create a solution, I'm pretty positive that we're going to get things underway. I'm really positive for the marine sector also.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll come to you next, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. I've probably touched on it a bit, but I think I already see that the way things are going in the marine environment is to be a more strategic approach, more joined up. And so I suppose my hope is that there's the right kind of policy and legislative drivers to generate that joined up approach and really drive some of that market. So it may be that some of the big marine sectors offer the initial driver for some of that investment and investment in nature and compensation. But as time goes on, I'd really hope that we do join that up with other schemes and we really do approach the marine environment in a far more strategic way, because I think that's the only way you can do that in the marine environment, as opposed to terrestrial, where you can be a bit more project by project based. I think it's absolutely necessary, and hopefully that's the way we're going.
Great, thanks, Alex. Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, I think I'd echo those two comments. I think hopeful by nature, Rachel, is a brilliant tagline, so I might copy that. I like that. I like that approach. I think the move to something more strategic, we're definitely seeing signs of that and seeing progress. I think the aggregation of multiple projects, so whether that's kind of the same habitat type across a larger area, or it's looking at multiple habitat types in that kind of landscape scale approach where you get those benefits. Also seeing much greater collaboration, I think, both within the sector, but also cross-sector as well. Hopefully what that leads to is, I think, as Alex alluded to, sort of more strategic projects, but also bigger projects. That aggregation, I think, can also then appeal to larger institutional investors, which potentially at the moment still aren't seeing the size of project to really kind of get them out of bed. You know, the real kind of £100 million, the big ticket projects that I think could really excite and hopefully act as that catalyst to move forward. So yeah, I think definitely optimism that we're moving in that direction, and I think the more kind of demonstration sites that we can pull together, and the more work we can do to collaborate and sort of show a consensus and a standard approach, should hopefully set us on a really positive track.
Right, thank you, Peter, for those positive words. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, share in the optimism. I think this call has made me feel even more optimistic just reading through some of the points in the Q&A. And I think when we set out with Crown Estate and Blue Marine Foundation, WWT, and many others on the work on the roadmap, the real goal there was to try to bring people together and to be able to mobilize action around a key set of areas. And so we've seen since the launch of the roadmap, seen a lot of interest, and even in the chat saw areas of interest there to pick up on. And so yeah, really hopeful that when we release the update on progress on the roadmap and in the next year's time, that we'll be able to show considerable progress in each of those areas.
Right. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for your words at the end there. Yeah, I'd just like to come to a close really and thank the audience. Thank you for attending and watching today, and thank you all of you watching it online live as well as the recordings. I'd like to thank our wonderful panel. You've been really excellent, really appreciate it. So Alex Thompson from Crown Estate, Peter Lee from WWT, Elizabeth Beale from Finance Earth, and Rachel Everett from Summit Fields Rewilding Britain. This recording will be on the OCF YouTube channel and website pretty soon. Please look out for the conference I mentioned that's happening in September, and also look out for further editions of our series on marine restoration. Thank you all for watching. Goodbye.